We got Brad Stulberg on the podcast. Brad is the author of Peak Performance and The Passion Paradox, both with Steve Bangas. Peak Performance, obviously about performing at a high level. Passion Paradox, about not messing yourself up while performing at a high level. Both excellent books. And Brad is also a regular contributor to Outside Magazine. And he's been featured in publications of note, New York Times, Wired, Sports Illustrated, etc. Brad coaches executives and physicians, and he also, with Steve, sends out a weekly newsletter called The Growth Equation, which is excellent. It includes articles written by Brad and Steve, as well as a bunch of curated stuff. I usually click through almost all the links and read those things as well, so highly recommended. And Brad and Steve have a new podcast that they just started called the Growth Equation Podcast, which we talk about a little bit in this interview. But this is a great conversation with Brad about all kinds of topics related to burnout, performing at a high level, and getting wrapped up in checking how many Twitter followers you have. So check this one out. Enjoy it. A lot of millennials are burning out all the time. And as a millennial myself, who has also burned out, what's our problem, Brad? Why are we such a burned out group of people?
So I too am a millennial. I'm an older millennial, I guess. I think it's like if you're born in 82, I was born in 86, so one of the older ones. And we can start here because we're both in this generation, but I actually think that though there's been a lot of recent press particular to millennial burnout, it's not just a millennial thing, it's an everyone thing. But I think that our generation, millennials, have grown up amidst a recession, and by grown up I meant like entered the workforce amidst a recession, and around the same time amidst the rise of the cult of productivity and self-improvement and optimization. And when you marry those two things, a feeling, whether real or just perceived, of economic insecurity, plus an overarching cultural value of grind and hustle and push, what you get are a lot of people that push, and can't turn it off. So I think on its face, that is the first layer of the onion. And then something that not many people consider, but I think is the second, third, fourth layer of the onion and is a large contributing factor, is we also are the first generation to really come into our own in terms of professional identity with social media. And that has led to a lot of people never really feeling like they can turn it off, because even if they're not at work, if they're tweeting, if they're writing a Facebook post or a LinkedIn post or a blog post, it's all part of this brand that you're trying to develop. And at its worst, your entire life becomes this brand. So like everything that you're doing kind of feels like work. And the highs and lows of that are quite extreme. And the highs are great when you do something that people love. But the lows, when you post something or share something, or you feel irrelevant for a day because you didn't post or share something, that doesn't feel so great. So I think it's a mix of those couple of factors that have got us to a place where lots of millennials are feeling burnt out.
Yeah, and I think there's another layer to it as well that you mentioned. You know, people are sort of riding this constant need to show up to different social platforms or post podcasts or something like that. And then there's another layer to it where if you feel like you're shouting into a void, that's also kind of a burnout generating thing, right? Where you want to get the connection that you see other people getting seemingly through their social posting or their content creation or whatever. And if you're not getting it, then that in and of itself is kind of like you're just pushing a boulder uphill endlessly.
I think so. And I think that it is, it has like an addictive quality too, where if you're used to getting feedback and for whatever reason, one day, 1 week, 1 month, you don't get that level of feedback, you can start to feel pretty crappy. And I think that for a lot of people, it's like a feeling of irrelevance. And to get even more meta and peel back this onion a bit more, the great irony of this, and it's like a tragic irony, is that then what happens is it pushes people to spend more time on digital devices, posting, trying to figure out how to be relevant really on the internet, when in fact, what would be better is for those people to become relevant in their own community. So, I mean, as somebody that is like quote unquote thought leader myself, I go through this all the time. I get into these periods where it generally for me happens that I write an essay or something that does really well. Then I'm like, oh, this is great. So I lean into Twitter, I lean into the internet, I'm getting all this positive feedback. And then eventually, like the essay fizzles out. It's had its loop. And suddenly, instead of getting hundreds of retweets, I'm getting 10, 15, 20 retweets. And I'm embarrassed to say this, but I'm a human. Like, it can start to make me feel crappy. The flip side of that is the times in my life when I'm like focusing on my core values and surrounding myself with the people that actually matter to me, I could care less about Twitter. Like, I've never finished a day hike with my close friends and gotten to the end and been like, oh, I need to check Twitter. Like, it doesn't occur to me because I'm actually like connecting in a more meaningful way. I'm feeling love in a more meaningful way than this feedback mechanism that is so ubiquitous.
Yeah, so to try to parse that out a little bit, I mean, you mentioned the idea of trying to get more involved in your local community to whatever, scratch that social itch. And something I'd be curious about is your thoughts on the difference between, let's say, performing online, right? Because a lot of social media is performative. You know, you're trying to display something about yourself by what you're posting on Instagram. You're trying to dunk on someone on Twitter in order to generate a certain amount of attention for yourself. You know, you're trying to whatever, and any of these things that are sort of focused on twisting a certain knob in the larger experience of how people are perceiving you, and contrast that with going on a hike with your closest friends. I mean, you know, you're probably not immune to social signaling in any situation. Like, you're always kind of running that software in the background, but that's a relatively low performance environment. What about the idea of trying to, you know, generate connection in your local community through something that you may need to perform by, like doing, right? I mean, that politics in and of itself, in a workplace, on a sports team, anything like that, you do have to kind of play these little games to signal something about yourself. So how do you think about that in the real world versus online?
So I think that, and my advice, because you mentioned this, and I think you're spot on, this happens both in the real world and online, is try to minimize that, try to seek out organizations, communities, teams where that is a very small part of how you become known, and choose to be in those venues, not venues where you feel like you have to perform. Generally speaking, if you feel like you're carrying a high burden of like performative stuff, that is going to make you feel worse down the road, potentially burn out down the road. And it's probably a signal that whatever you're doing is not a good fit. And that can change too. Again, as somebody that exists largely on the internet, there are times when I'm not being performative at all. And there are times when I'm being performative. And the texture of that experience is very different. At the end of the performative days, I can kind of feel like, what the hell? Like, I've been busy for the last 12 hours, but I haven't really done anything. This sucks. Whereas the days when I'm not in a performative mode and I'm just like being authentic and real in what I write and what I share, those days feel pretty good. So, you know, the internet is not bad. It is a tool, and we have to use the tool with a lot of self-awareness. And again, the same thing in the real world. I think that if you notice yourself carrying this big burden of feeling like you're always acting or playing a certain role, that's a good like cue to step back and say, do I really need to be doing this, or is this in my head? And if I do really need to be doing this, do I really want to be involved in an organization or a group of friends or whatever it is where playing the politics matters so much?
I'm curious if some people actually just like that and find fulfillment from it, though, right? I mean, if you think about, you know, actually a somewhat topical example, the Bulls documentary has been airing, and I've been
it's been great. I've been watching it.
Yeah, as someone who are we doing? As a millennial who grew up just outside of Chicago, I literally stayed home from school the day that Michael Jordan retired for the first time. I was so upset. Too. I couldn't go to school. Wait, where did you grow up?
I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit.
Incredible. Wait, so you should have hated Michael Jordan then.
I was like everybody else, right? I hated him, but I loved him.
Got it.
So in 89 to 92, when the Pistons were really battling, I was still young. I was like 6, 7, 8 years old. So my memories of MJ were more from like the Grant Hill era of the Pistons, where the Pistons weren't really very good. Yeah, so totally. We'd lose in the first round of the playoffs, and then I would just get to watch Michael Jordan dominate.
Yep. Yeah, fair. But yeah, that really hit home for me. I was like, I just can't go to school. I'm just crying and I'm so embarrassed.
Were you a Chicago kid?
Yeah, I grew up just outside of the city. Yeah. So yeah, deeply emotional. But anyway, to sort of circle back to where I was going with that, Dennis Rodman, is talking about finding this sort of performative aspect of his personality, and that actually for him was a positive, right? It became positive for him to kind of adopt a bunch of different characters and sort of play out different roles and wear absurd clothes and get reactions from people, right? And I mean, you hesitate to comment on people's mental health from afar, but it's like, okay, if you're able to kind of tap into something there through this performance that you're putting on, intended to garner media attention, intended to create controversy, et cetera, right? I mean, people are doing that all the time on social media. And I wonder if some percentage of them don't actually just have like a net positive experience from that. What do you think?
I can't play armchair psychologist. I don't know if Dennis Rodman has had a net positive experience. This is the same guy that like fell asleep in the parking lot of a practice facility in his car with a gun and said that he's very lucky he fell asleep, because if he didn't, he doesn't know if he'd still be here. Yeah. So I think that Rodman was going through some stuff, and he struggled with addiction. He struggled with drinking. He struggled with gambling. So I don't know who the real Dennis Rodman is. I don't think that anyone does. And maybe the real Dennis Rodman is this person that just gets off on acting and performing in different ways. But I think that even if that's the case, that would be the exception, which proves the rule. And I'm not convinced that Rodman is the exception. Like this is a guy that loves Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Like he's just a bizarro character. So Rodman aside, is there a time and a place to like network in perform? Totally. I just think that it takes a lot of energy, and the more energy you spend on that, the more you're going to struggle with the other elements of your job and the worse you're going to feel. Are there some exceptions? Sure. If you're a politician, or like if you're an actor or an actress and like a huge, like that is a core competency of the job, great. But if you are an athlete, if you are a writer, if you are a small business owner, like your craft is not performing and getting people to like you. Your craft is training, writing, building a business. And I think that what happens is because it is so seductive in this day and age to feel relevant, people end up spending so much time thinking about how to quote unquote be liked or be relevant, and less time on their craft. So again, I love putting my own skin in the game because I'm not perfect on any of this stuff. I figure it out as I go. For me, there are days when I can be relatively focused on reading and writing and having interesting conversations like this. And at the end of those days, I feel very good. I feel well nourished. I feel like I accomplished something meaningful and productive in the world. There are days where I work the same amount of hours, where a lot of that day is spent on Twitter, thinking of things to tweet, replying to tweets, checking how many new followers I have. I generally feel really shitty at the end of those days. So I think for me, in myself and the individuals that I coach, the guiding principle is like less checking and less peripheral work and less trying to game the system to be relevant, and more getting really good at your craft and spending time with the people that you actually want to spend time with.
Yeah, I think that's an insightful point, that for some people, the process of performing is in fact their craft, right? And even those folks, there's probably, different types of performing. You think of like a stand-up comic or whatever that are, that culture is notorious for dedication to the craft and just getting on stage and working out material and things like that. But then they have these kind of adjacent careers where they need to, host podcasts or post on Twitter or whatever to try to maintain a following between their specials. And that for those folks, they may get something out of the aspect of trying to maintain relevance, but it's potentially similar enough to their actual craft that those are kind of helpful. But yeah, for someone like an athlete, it could be totally draining to say, okay, I need to, do this to keep my sponsors happy.
Right. And it's hard because I was going to say
but
it's a part of the job. So I'm not like, I wish there was a world where we could all just be like, screw it, let's just focus on the craft. But exactly, like as a writer, I need people to read my book. As an athlete, you need sponsors. As a gym owner and an entrepreneur, you need people to hear about your gym and engage with you. So I think that it is a necessary part of a business or part of developing a brand. I think, again, it comes back to just being hyper self-aware of how you're using it, how it's making you feel, and when you start getting diminishing marginal returns. And for some people, maybe it's not really a part of their business or their brand. If you are working a 9-to-5 for a large organization, whether or not you're on social media probably doesn't matter to how well you work and whether or not you get your paycheck. If you're starting a business, if you're a creative person, if you're selling something direct to consumers, social media is a very helpful way to get the word out. And that's a dangerous game because there's just enough and then there's way too much in terms of like time and energy spent on these things. And it's a very fine line.
Yeah, totally. And something else to consider, and I liked one of the things you said just about like diminishing marginal returns is, if you think about what are you actually trying to accomplish, whether it's, in your case, spreading a certain message and, having enough readers and enough interest to be able to spread that message, like what is the actual limiting factor, right? Is it the number of Twitter followers that you have? Like at some point it might be. Right? Like that's actually a very realistic thing that if you're going to pitch, someone on an article or a book idea and they go and look at your Twitter page and you have 400 followers and, no one seems to care, like they're going to be less interested. But if you have a blue check mark and a number of followers in the thousands, like, does it matter that much if you have 25,000 followers versus 50? I'm not really sure. So there's points where it may be actually the most important thing you can do to actually work on that.
Love it. And I'm so glad you're bringing this up, Todd, because I think that there's a tendency in the like self-improvement, personal growth, performance space to sugarcoat this stuff and be like, oh, don't worry about like Twitter. Like that's bullshit. The person telling you not to worry about Twitter is probably verified with 100,000 followers.
Oh, completely.
So like there is a game to play and a lot of people have to play it. It's just how do you play it in a way that doesn't zap all of your energy, physical and emotional? And as you said, like when is enough enough? Maybe you set out to open a gym and you're like, if I can have a membership of like 200, that'll be great. And then of course you get 200, then you're like, oh, but I need 500 and then you need 1,000. And I think it's just being aware that we all have these tendencies and just to constantly be kind of evaluating, like, what am I putting in and what am I getting out of this? Am I just chasing more for the dopamine rush and the thrill of more, or is this actually valuable? And it's often not so black or white. It's often gray. And there are no right answers. I wish I could be like, once you hit this number of members at your gym or this many readers of your books or this many employees in your company, you can stop worrying about being relevant out in the world. It's not that simple. I think that it changes based on the person, based on what they're doing, based on the point of their career, based on what's happening around them. So if people get anything out of this segment of the conversation, I think it's just know that these forces exist, know that nobody is so freaking zen or stoic that they're not moved by the need to be relevant on the internet, and know that the more you're aware of it and the more you pay attention, you adjust as you go. And it's not to say you're not going to have some bad days where you get totally sucked into the internet and feel crappy after, but hopefully you'll end up having less of them.
Yeah, totally. And then you touched on a few things, just the idea of you have these goals that you're shooting for in terms of, you could have any number of metrics. If you're an athlete, it's a certain performance number. If you're an author, it's a certain number of books sold. If you're a musician, it's records sold,
downloads,
streams
I guess,
on Spotify.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you're like, oh, cool, this is great. My band just put out a record and we got more monthly listeners than we've ever had, and like it actually felt pretty good. I was like, yeah, this is great. But the feeling of that is fleeting. It goes away pretty quickly. And so this is something you touched on in one of your books, just this idea of you have something that you think is going to be, it's going to check the box and you're going to feel good about it, but it goes away right away. And there's certain types of people that are prone to having that experience. And then that just causes them to double down and work even harder and potentially push themselves to unhealthy levels of all kinds of things. What do you think is actually going on for those individuals?
Oh man, this is a great question. So I think this is the human condition. We evolved to always want more, right? Like the neurochemicals in our brain that are associated with striving or craving or chasing after something are stronger than the ones that make us feel content. And that is because way back when our species was transitioning from like ape to human, when we were out hunting, if we got a big kill, we couldn't just be satisfied because there could be a famine. So we couldn't just sit around and be like, oh, we got our kill, let's be content. It was, okay, we got the kill, let's like eat, save, and go get more. So it is in our DNA to strive for more and more and more. It is not a bad thing. We have vaccines, we have transportation, like so many of the incredible human breakthroughs are because of this. The downside is, like you said, in an individual level, we think that if we just get this next thing, then we'll be content, then we'll have enough. But what ends up happening is you get the next thing, and exactly like you said, it's fleeting. Maybe you feel good for a day or two, and then you're back at it wanting even more. There's a behavioral science term that is so apt for this. It's called the arrival fallacy. And that is just that. You think that you're going to arrive and be like, oh, I made it. But you'll be happy for an hour, a day, maybe a week, and then you'll want more. So I think that it's realizing that this is the human condition. And then the way out of it is to try to create a life, a community, a craft, a process where focusing on and being engaged in the process is more meaningful and more valuable than any of those results that are temporary that you arrive at. And know that checking the metrics and feeling really good in the moment usually feels better than being involved in the process. But over the long haul, being involved in the process feels better. So the analogy that I'm using in my next book project for this, and I love testing it, and some people like immediately get it and talk about feedback, and others like, this makes no sense, so I'll try it with you. There's peanut M&Ms and brown rice. And peanut M&Ms is like looking at metrics and being really happy about certain successes or being really sad about failures. And brown rice is doing the work itself. So if you're confronted with a bag of peanut M&Ms or a bowl of brown rice, every time you're going to choose the peanut M&Ms because they taste better. But if you just sit and eat peanut M&Ms all day, day after day, eventually you start feeling sick. Whereas if you choose brown rice over peanut M&Ms, that initial choice is tougher, but after a day, a week, a month, a year of eating brown rice, you feel really whole and nourished. And to me, checking external stuff is eating peanut M&Ms and doing the actual work that you like. That's the brown rice. So that's how I've come to think of it. And over time, I think you gradually start to change your taste buds.
Yeah, totally. I think that's, I mean, it makes a lot of sense in that, you know, the idea of the peanut M&M is that sort of quick, like it gives you something immediately in the moment and you feel something positive based upon, you know, eating
right. But if you eat it all day, you feel like crap. Yeah. And again, like very few people, if any, like reach this bliss point where they just have this down. I think it's about having these mental models and then paying good attention. So for me, a victory isn't spending a day like warped in the rabbit hole of social media feeling shitty, but it's not spending a week. It's after one day being like, like I think I just ate peanut M&Ms. I need to turn this off for the next couple days. And that to me is the goal, is to have that level of awareness, to be able to name what's happening, and then to be able to make a choice. Do you want to continue or do you want to switch into something else? This gets back to something that we opened with. I think that working a lot and working many hours is only one part of burnout. I think that equally important is the work that you're actually doing in those hours. And if you're a writer and you're writing all the time, or you're an athlete and you're training all the time, or you're a small business owner and you're building the business all the time, you probably won't get burnt out. I mean, granted, if you're not sleeping, sure, but like you can work 12-hour days forever if you love the work that you're doing. What happens though is if you start to get concerned with all these other external things and your self-worth gets tied up in them and you kind of constantly have to be getting the next best thing, then it's really easy to get burned out because there's this constant anxiety of it's like, this isn't enough. I'm not enough. What I've built isn't enough. I need more. So it's about keeping that in check.
Yeah, the idea of the external stuff too is really interesting in that there's so many different layers to what's going on where, as we discussed before, there may be some external things that you need to hit, right? You may need to actually shoot to get a blue check mark on Twitter if you want to write for certain magazines, right? You may need to have a certain number of members at your gym if you want to stay in business, and you actually need to be targeting these external things. And I think it's really interesting which things like that actually become tied into our self-worth and which ones don't, and especially which ones we can actually control and which ones we can't, right? Because if you think about, I can speak to gym members as a good example, right? That's an important metric, and I need to know that. I need to keep track of it. And there's not a lot I can do to immediately impact that, right? I can do a lot of work on a lot of different things, and it may or may not have anything to do with the number of members we have, right? Right now, the number of members we have is absolutely terrible because we're closed and are going to be closed for a while,
Yeah. And you tell me like what your experience is, but I think that, and this is why what's happening with COVID is so hard for so many people right now, is the place that is stable and always there, regardless of how many members you have or how many followers you have or how many people are reading your book, is your core community. And what sucks right now is that we can't really see our core communities. But for me, that's like the home base or the place that I can always come back to. And regardless of whatever the fuck is happening out in terms of like external validation land, if I've got my people that I can come back to where I know I'm accepted and I have a good time with, then everything is okay. So again, back to burnout, the topic of this conversation, it's making me think of another factor, which is we chase all this productivity and more. And as a result, what gets cannibalized is time for building community because we're always working in front of screens. But it's the actual community that is what makes us feel solid and stable when we get on the roller coaster of highs and lows and whatever we're doing.
Yeah. So what do you think would be a way for people to switch their focus more onto community? Because everyone, I think, probably agrees with that in the abstract. They're like, yes, this sounds awesome. I love community. My people are what matter to me. But then when it comes down to it, the actual behavior that people do is that it's easier to
to tweet,
stay home and work.
Yeah, you have to tweet. You have
to
you have to force yourself to eat the brown rice. So schedule it and know that this resistance is coming. Just like the mindset shift is really helpful. So an example of this for me is, and I'm going to have to probably do some work on this once my gym opens up again, is I love to train, and I particularly love to train with my two training partners. But we all have different schedules, and going to the gym, the three of us together, requires that we modify our schedules, and I can't go when it's ideal for me, and I have to interrupt a time that I would otherwise be working. So there's this temptation to just go on my own, get it done. Or like I've got a couple kettlebells, just train at home, like really get it done fast so I can get back to work. And in the moment, that feels like the easier, better thing to do. But if I go a week or two without training with this group, I start to feel like crap. And I've done the same amount of exercise, so it's not a physiological thing, it's a social thing. So over time, I've come to know that like even if I'm being literally like there's an energy force pulling me to my computer to do work and just tell them, hey guys, I'm going to train on my own when I'm ready for a break, that doesn't work in the long term. What I need to do is get my ass to the gym to train with these guys because I'll feel better. And it probably won't really matter if I don't chase whatever idea I had. I can write it down in a notepad. It can wait until after. So I think just the awareness that the choosing community in the moment often feels like the worst choice, but in the long term, it's the better choice. To a point. Again, I'm not sitting here and saying like, oh, just hang out with your friends all day and don't do anything if you're trying to break through in your career. But I think a lot of people struggle with the opposite, which is like they're so focused on being productive that community gets crowded out.
Yeah, and I think that that's a good point too, because a lot of the people who are going to be listening to this conversation are people who are probably on the end of the spectrum of tending to work too hard. Right. Yeah. There are people who train too hard. They work too hard. They stay up too late answering emails. They subscribe to more podcasts than they can actually listen to. Right. There are people who are like actually doing too much stuff, and being able to take a step back is potentially beneficial for them. But a lot of the messaging, like you said before, in the marketplace related to ideas is, you have to grind, you have to hustle, you need to be more productive. So how do you think about where your message sits in the marketplace of ideas, where a lot of people are offering something that doesn't actually seem to be optimized for what people who are doing something hard need to hear?
Another good one. So I think that there's a lot of extreme views in the performance and well-being market, and I think that those extreme views sell. And I don't think that when the rubber meets the road and you actually want to perform at your best, whatever it is you're doing, that you can rely on these extreme views. I think the answer is often more nuanced, and I think it's not an either or approach, but a both and approach. Often also the things that really help you eventually get in your way. So an example, Jocko Willenick is a beast in terms of inspiration and motivation. He's got a highly listened to podcast, a #1 best-selling book. He was a Marine. I've never met him. He appears to be super fit. He's a badass. He is like grind till you die. I wake up every morning at 3:45 a.m. to do push-ups. On and on and on. There's a point in your life, like I'm not against waking up at 4 a.m. to do push-ups. Sometimes that's what you need to do. But that very behavior will help you until it gets in your way. And that's something that I wish that Jocko in that whole gain of grind would say. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's the woo-woo, all we need to do is rest. Everybody's working too hard. Things are impossible for millennials. We got dealt a bad hand. We need more help. Rest, rest, rest. Okay, maybe sometime, but that's not going to work either. So or it's only going to work for a period of time. So what I try to do with how I think and what I try to do in my own life is realize that most things have value. It's just figuring out when is the right place to apply that concept, and when is something that used to work for you not going to work anymore. And then more broadly speaking, in terms of performance, it's a big part of my first book, you need stress and you need rest to grow. So anyone that tells you just stress, 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 bullshit, because you need rest to grow. Anyone that tells you things are so hard, just rest, 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 also bullshit, because you need stress and challenge to grow. And you can get addicted to stress and you can get addicted to rest, and neither is good. I guess that stress plus rest equals growth is an overarching concept that Steve, my co-author, and I introduced to the world that sums up to me everything I just said about it's not either or, it's generally both and at certain points of your life, the stress dial is going to be high, but then you're going to need to compensate later on with increased rest.
Yeah, and I think that
does that make sense? There's so
no,
because
totally
I just
does.
feel like there's so much out there on both of these extremes, and then the extremes yell at each other, and you see this in politics too. It's everyone needs to pick themselves up by the bootstraps, and then which I don't agree with. And then the opposite is everything is structural. Nobody you can't have someone have personal responsibility. I also don't agree with. It's no, you need to pick yourself up by the bootstraps, and you need to be in a structure where you're supported and you can do that. And I think that kind of either or thinking is just proliferated in today's hot take environment, and certainly in the performance and well-being genre.
Yeah, totally. I think that ties into some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, where, a lot of the folks who are making these kind of extreme statements that don't have a lot of nuance or gray area or even recognize trade-offs, right, are essentially, they're not necessarily making a living by actually coaching people who are trying to do a hard thing and get better at it. Right, which is
they don't have skin in the game. Yeah,
exactly. Right,
and it must make your skin crawl to listen to these people that are these talking heads that haven't coached someone in years, if ever at all.
Yeah, or in some cases they are coaches, but they recognize the difference between, okay, I'm now in my performing role to the world of Instagram, where my market isn't someone who's actually trying to get better at something and is taking it seriously and is already performing at a high level. My market is people who like the idea of thinking about potentially maybe doing something someday.
Right. And, they want the inspirational rah-rah dopamine peanut M&M quote. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Right. And so you have this sort of performative environment where people aren't actually doing what you should do to coach someone. You're playing a character in a movie for someone who likes the idea of thinking about taking action someday. And that's just like not what people who are actually doing shit need to hear.
Yeah. And I mean, you're like in strength and conditioning and CrossFit. I think that's probably like the corner of the performance world where what you're describing is the worst based on like my limited experience there.
Yeah, it's strange, right? Because you have what people are looking for again is not necessarily what they actually need. So you have this perverse incentive to provide people what they're looking for in order to get attention. But then you sort of get caught in this feedback loop of like, oh, when I post dumb Fitspo stuff, I actually get engagement. So I guess I'll keep doing that, because when I post like stuff about nuance and needing to understand the big picture and actually think about why you're doing things, like no one cares.
Yep, totally.
It's a challenging environment for good ideas.
Yeah, but I think that we have to keep trying. Because like otherwise it's just and it gets back to like the community thing is something that often comes up for me is people ask me to join in on other projects or to try to expand and grow. And I really like keeping my little thing small, because I don't need to grow. And I think that like the more you grow, the more you have to compete for attention in that world. And I'm happy to have like a newsletter with 15, 20,000 people, not 400,000 people, if it means I don't have to write clickbait stuff. And I think like, another cause of burnout is growth at all costs, but it's like what, like growing for what? And some people like want to have a vision of really changing the world. And I get that. I think it's really hard to do. And I'm not convinced that like trying to grow is what gets you there. So again, there's no right or wrong, but the example that I always think about is Whole Foods. So Whole Foods was like this cash cow grocery store in Texas that was this quirky one-of-a-kind grocer owned by two people that was a complete staple of their community. So what on earth, to me, because I'm wired differently, like what makes those people be like, oh, like we should grow? Because I'm of the camp of like, oh, I'm going to make this the best grocery store in the world, and I'm going to focus just on this single thing. And again, and value is neutral. There's no right or wrong way to do it. But for me, one way around this, and you could say it's like knowing yourself, you could say it's a cop-out, is like I am like super, in my personal life and professional life, I'm super cognizant of when I choose to grow, because like growing means more complexity. Professionally, it means like having to compete for people's attention more. So I'm a big fan of like, how can I keep things simple? How can I stay true to like the things that I actually love? And how can I be happy with 100 people, not 1,000, or 1,000 people, not 10,000, or 10,000, not 1,000,000? Because you keep going, and then you get Tony Robbins, who is like, probably the most followed like performance self-improvement guru. And my guess is that guy's really smart, but if you listen to the shit that he's spouting, a lot of it is just like off the rails, because he's at like that 1 million person level. I'm going to get political for a minute, and I know you're a Chicago boy. This is why I freaking love Barack Obama. Like, totally. To me, he is like he is the person that like got the millions by being like super nuanced and thoughtful. Didn't really work. I mean, you could say it worked. He was freaking president. You could say it didn't work, because look where we are now. But very few people can maintain that level of like thoughtfulness as they rise.
Yeah. And for without really knowing too much about the details and the ins and outs of his campaign and everything, he was able to simultaneously maintain his nuanced thoughts, right? And be able to speak to the public in a nuanced manner, while also touching on kind of like simple, fluffy things that people can latch onto, right? Like in terms of figuring out how to turn a message of hope into something that's simple, clickable, social media shareable, but still gives him the ability to dive into the nuance as necessary.
Yep, totally. And I think, my guess is there's a lot of people listening to this that are into athletics. So back to the Bulls documentary, it's a little bit different, but like I feel like Phil Jackson's a pretty good example of this. That guy, like, is a phenomenal coach, And he was very nuanced, and he could go give the media the Zen quote that was the most clickbaity thing in the world. So maybe like you're helping me realize that part of it is like realizing like when it's time to play the game, but sticking to your principles when it really matters. But that's very hard to do.
Yeah, and how can you play the game in a way that doesn't cause you to compromise your principles, right? Because that's I think the really tricky thing. You use Whole Foods as an example. You can think of academics too, people who started off in a certain vein of research and then realized that maybe their results weren't quite exciting enough. And so they started fiddling with data a little bit and started to get some attention and started fiddling even more. And it becomes this very slippery slope of giving up on what you were actually trying to do in order to kind of like tweak those knobs to get more attention for yourself.
And I think researchers have it hard. Like I feel very fortunate to be a writer and a coach because I am so transparent that I have very few things figured out. In most everything, 99% of the things that I write about, with a few exceptions, I am just writing for the sake of figuring it out. When I coach, the same thing. I am there to ask good questions and walk a path with someone, but I very rarely have the answers. Answers I do have, like don't smoke, and if you smoke, get help quitting. Like if you're drinking more than 2 drinks a day, that's not how. Like there are some things where I'm very confident, but they're the most basic things. The higher up the ladder of performance, the more I don't know, and the more I'm allowed to say, like, hey, I'm not the world's expert on this. I don't know. I'm trying to figure it out and communicate my process of figuring it out. And I like it, for a little while, I thought like I was hiding behind that, but now I realize that like, no, like that's always going to be true. And if somebody is looking for the answer, then they're not going to find the answer for me. What hopefully they'll find is like a way to help think towards that answer. And I think you're like, clearly you're similar. Like even in this conversation, we haven't given listeners any answers, but there are these models that can help you work toward it. And again, it changes over time. Like, things look a lot different in the middle of a pandemic than they look 6 months ago. And it might be a season for small business owners on the way out of this where it's grind really hard. And if you're sitting there saying like, oh, but so-and-so told me I need to rest, otherwise I'm going to burn out. Well, like, okay, but you're making a trade-off. And now might be a time where like you need to burn, the candle at both ends for a period of time. So I think it's about like having these tools and being really self-aware and thoughtful of when to apply them.
Yeah, and to speak personally to that example, that's been completely true for me, right? That throughout the course of closing the gym down and trying to move our classes online and figure out what's going on with various small business loans and grants and things like that, I've definitely been working at a level that is not sustainable, right? When we first took over the location that we're in, and had, all kinds of crazy problems going on and trying to build out a gym and having nowhere near enough members and raising money and having investors flake and just kind of like constantly dying, right? I mean, I was working an unbelievable amount and was totally unsustainable, and it like messed my life up for a while. And then I kind of went back to that for the last probably, 4 weeks or so, and it hasn't felt good. But
are you feeling
it's like, okay, this is what we got to do.
Yeah. Are you feeling hopeful?
Medium. I think that for our personal situation, I know how bad it is for everyone in the fitness industry, and it is a little bit of a zero-sum game, and that, if other gyms or fitness providers don't make it through this, that benefits us. Mm-hmm. And I think that we're probably more resilient than others. So that's somewhat hopeful, I suppose.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But yeah, I mean, to your point, it's like, okay, there are times when it's like, you just got to do it. You just got to suck it up and get it done. But then recognizing that there are potential downstream consequences to that and deciding, when are you going to work that hard? When are you going to dip into your emergency fund of savings that you say you're not going to touch? Well,
yeah,
a global pandemic is that time.
Totally. The analogy in sports, it's like, there's this expression, maybe you've heard it, is like you go to a workout and you see God, and like you can only visit God like twice a year. Otherwise, like, you're going to get injured or you're going to get sick. But like, there are times when you go see God. So like that, you know, to touch on something we said earlier, like anyone that tells you like, yeah, like wake up and see God like every single day, no, you're going to get hurt. That's stupid. But anyone that tells you like, oh, you should never push, like that's also bullshit. So it's about like finding that balance, which is hard to do.
Yeah. And what do you recommend for people in situations where they don't have you always have a choice, but where it is the right time to actually dig in and just kill yourself with work or kill yourself with training or whatever?
So it's something like very concrete is have a couple people, ideally a couple, at least one person that's not you, that you really trust, that you will listen to, that can tell you like, Todd, stop. Like you don't see what I see. You're putting yourself in a hole that you're not going to be able to get out of. Because when we go all in on something that we care about, it's so easy to lose all perspective. And that's where it can be so helpful to have someone that you trust to tell you when you're losing perspective or when you're beyond the point of diminishing marginal returns. Ways to gain perspective individually is just spend a day like hiking in nature. For one, you're away from devices and working, and two, there is research that shows that when you're like out moving your body in nature, you just gain perspective because you're out amidst the natural world, which has been around forever, and you can come back to your computer at the end of that day and maybe see things more clearly. But that requires that you're willing to take a day where you totally unplug. So I think like further up the chain, it's just having people to call you out and say like, hey, this seems like not great. And then you have to listen to those people.
Yeah. And adjacent to that, how do you recommend people find perspective with how much they're potentially compromising their values and what they're trying to work on in order to gain that external status, right? How do you have someone recognize, you know, when they are the academic who's about to fudge the data, or when they are the author who's spending too much time on Twitter?
So those are two separate things, right? The fudging the data you never do, because like that is just cheating. It's like, and it goes against it should go against your values as an academic. That's like doping in sport, or like, I don't know what the equivalent would be, like buying followers on Twitter, maybe. Which like if you're doing, that's tough. But as an aside, because I gotta like I gotta slay some people. Like the some of my favorite things on the internet are the people with like 400,000 followers, and then like you go to their profile and like they get zero engagement, and you know that those followers are just like robots.
The ratio's off.
Yeah,
exactly. The engagement ratio's off.
Yeah. But I get it. If you're like desperate to write a book and you hear that publishers look how many Twitter followers you have, like, yeah, you're going to play that game. I think now publishers are a little bit smarter, but who knows? Anyways, as an aside, so coming back to your question, I think that like you just use how you feel as a guide. Like most people, when they're spending too much time not executing on what they really value, start to feel bad. And that's when you can pull out and say, like, I wonder why I'm feeling like crap. Let me examine what I've been doing the last few days. And if what you've been doing the last few days is not in alignment with what you actually want to be doing, then it gives you an opportunity to shift. There are, again, like all these concepts work until they don't. There are totally times and places where you have to release from that. So I can only speak to what I know best. So when I'm launching a book, it's going to be a month where I am like a full-time self-promotional marketer, and I'm going to feel terrible, and I'm going to feel gross, and I'm going to complain to my wife and to my friends, and they're just going to tell me 4 more weeks, 4 more weeks, 4 more weeks. And I get through it, and then it's over. Because it would be stupid to like be sitting reading novels the week that your book is coming out. Like, of course you want to push really hard. So again, but like self-awareness is the key. Knowing what you're doing, knowing why you're doing it, and knowing for how long you want to do it.
Yeah, totally. Have you read, I don't remember the exact title, Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me?
No, but it's a good title.
Yeah, it's excellent. It's a pretty detailed dive into the mechanics of self-justification, right? And it goes into how people kind of go down these negative roads of fraud or cheating or whatever. And it usually starts with mild, seemingly justifiable violations of their internal moral code. And then based upon that process, they start justifying their past behavior. And then that leads to them feeling more comfortable doing the things that they were doing previously and just kind of like spiraling out of control. And eventually they end up doing stuff that's completely nuts, but it started as something that seemed innocent
Totally.
and justifiable.
Like Lance Armstrong is a really good athlete and a really smart dude. And like, I don't think Lance Armstrong is a terrible person, but I think that he was living in an alternate reality for a period of time.
Completely. Yeah. And based upon
still
that
is
example,
in some ways.
Oh, yeah.
Like he doesn't want to give up his jerseys. He still justifies what he did, but to most people in the outside world, it's pretty clear that he cheated.
Yeah. I mean, and to his point, everyone was cheating, and it's like, yeah, that's real.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, having coached some people who have been caught doping and people who I strongly suspect of such behaviors, sometimes as a coach, you're sort of aware of it, and other times not necessarily, but you can kind of see that stuff starting to happen. You're like, interesting. How did you get here? And what can I do about it?
Yeah. And again, I think that when you're competing, it's different because then you're like taking someone else's lunch per se. But like, there's a dude that works out at my gym who uses steroids and like is open about it and like kind of wishes that he doesn't. And you can kind of hear him justifying. He's like, well, Joe Rogan's like a fan of it, of testosterone. And I'm like, but like, what's the end point, man? Like eventually you're going to get older. And I kind of feel bad for him. Because it's like you're not competing. It'd almost be like in a weird way better if he was competing, because like then at least there's like a there. But
Sure,
he's just
totally.
doing it to like look a certain way and be able to lift a certain amount of weight. And I'm like, dude, you're chasing your tail. So like, yeah, I mean, I do feel bad for people like that, and I freaking get the allure as an athlete that trains. It's like, heck yeah, I want to lift more. And if I didn't spend so much time thinking and writing about this, I'd probably be prone to like doing some pretty shady stuff. But like, I just know that like it never actually makes things better down the road. As David Foster Wallace, who's brilliant, said, like, if you worship your body or you worship validation, like eventually you're going to be miserable. So like you should pick something else to worship, because we all get old and we all become irrelevant.
Yeah, completely. It's a check that's just waiting to be cashed.
Exactly.
There. You know what's coming. So Brad, we talked about the growth equation a little bit. What's the deal with the newsletter? I mean, I'm a subscriber and I love it. Why do you guys do that? Why do you spend so much time curating content and sending people articles?
So to tie it into this conversation, we do it for a few reasons. But in the us is my partner on that, Steve Magnus, and I. The main reason is because we don't enjoy marketing. So we enjoy creating. And the newsletter started out purely as a marketing thing. It was like, before our first book, how can we get people's emails so that we can sell our book? I'm being totally honest with you guys. But like, we really enjoyed it. And we weren't just saying buy our book, we were writing interesting articles. So now it's like in marketing speak, it's like, it's not even content marketing, because I don't think it is marketing. I think like now we've got a community where we tease out ideas. And for us, it's become a testing ground to see what ideas resonate for future articles, for future books. It's evolved into a podcast, a discussion group. We end up learning so much from the emails that we get in response to the newsletters that we send out. So it's really just fun. It's like a bizarro answer, but I'm thinking like, why do we do this? We have fun with it. I mean, yeah, as authors, you need to be able to reach people when you launch books, but you only launch books every few years. But it also keeps us fresh. It keeps us writing, and it keeps us connected to people that are interested in this sort of thing. And it tells us when we miss badly, because it doesn't happen often, but we've written some things where people are like, what the fuck are you talking about? And it makes us think twice.
That's great. So if people want to sign up for this newsletter or listen to your podcast or buy your books or any of these various content consumption opportunities, what should they do?
So the best place to find all the information is at the website, which is www.thegrowtheq.com for Growth Equation. And the newsletter is called The Growth Equation. The books are Peak Performance and The Passion Paradox. And the podcast is also called The Growth Equation. So, which
just launched maybe a month ago?
Yeah, we started that about a month ago. Yeah. Kind of similar to the newsletter, just another event. Steve and I were having, our podcast similar to yours. They're conversations like this. And we were having these conversations weekly anyways. So we decided to record them and play around with a podcast.
Love it. So check all that stuff out. It's all good. I participate in consuming all of that content, and I find it to be fulfilling. So highly recommend it. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, the best thing to do would be to send it to one of your friends who also likes podcasts. If you want more, I have an email list where I send out a weekly update with all the podcasts I've recorded and articles that I've written. I also include my favorite things that I've been reading or listening to as well. You can sign up for that at www.toddneve.com. That's I before E, or you can open up the show notes in your podcast player and click the link in there.